Thank you, Ron, for that introduction. And I'm Brian Diamond, CEO of Land Status. And for the last 30 years, I, along with my staff, have been helping companies with the challenges of centralized computing. We'll talk about centralized computing, not necessarily VDI, but you'll understand that in a minute. It's included technologies from major vendors, desktops, servers alike. And I've run several other technology firms, including a consulting firm and even a cabling company along the way. I've sat on the reseller committees for Citrix, VMware, NVIDIA, as well as others, and have helped companies like Hewlett-Packard and Dell solve issues in their delivery of remote access solutions. And what we're going to talk through in the next 20, 25 minutes, a little bit how we got here, who the players are, some real-world examples of successful deployments and where they had challenges, and then best practices that we have followed in our deployments. A few things that are consistent in the last 30 years, I'd say, is that the whole notion of virtual desktop is either the greatest thing since sliced bread or misery loves company. So let's all get on the bandwagon. When VDI started, it was to provide centralized access to a few very specific applications. But today, when we talk about VDI, it's to provide a complete and robust desktop experience for that end user. And we're going to go over the remote workforce and challenges, real-world examples, and best practices. Some of the slides I may simply gloss over quickly to make sure I have enough time. If anybody has any questions afterwards, happy to go over that with you one-on-one. So Land Status is a Connecticut-based systems integrator. We're established back in 2001. As I said, I've been working in this for 30 years, but I started Land Status 19 years ago. And we were a monitoring and remote management company. What people call them MSP today was really just remote NOC services. And, give you an idea of how far back 2001 was, we were still using pagers, flip phones. The iPhone didn't even come out till 2007, and the iPad was 2011. It's hard to believe that that technology hasn't always been with us. The cloud was still in the sky. We used modems to connect to the internet, and even Google was in its infancy, not even being public until 2004. They actually incorporated or reincorporated, I think, in 2002. So Google wasn't even that well-defined search engine. And, working from home was not really something that was, that was anywhere. Today with COVID, everybody works remotely and has for the last few months. And we used to have our coverage, say, North America, Canada, and Latin America, because that's where we had engineers. But today, pretty much anywhere we can work simply by getting up on with our GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar or remote access tools. So just to some of our offerings that we have here as a Citrix Platinum partner, and we do highlight Citrix. A lot of the things that we talk about and that are in our presentation have a Citrix slant, but I want you to look at them as it pertains to the industry as a whole, and I'll point out those parts. We work a lot with Microsoft, with VMware, with Google, with a number of other technologies, including Cisco and IGEL that are on the presentation today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those as we move forward. I want to showcase that we not only have been migrating people to the cloud, but we offer a variety of assessments, including cloud and VDI assessments. It's one of the reasons that Hewlett-Packard subcontracts work to us. And as part of this webinar, we are offering some high-level VDI health assessments at no charge. If you happen to have a VDI deployment and you'd like us to take a look at it and provide a report to you on what we see, please just get to me afterwards, and I'll have all of my contact information highlighted later. So on Thursday in March, I was having a discussion with one of our healthcare accounts in New York City, and we were discussing their plans for Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop, or WVD, and how the pilot of 2 users was going with their Samsung phones. WVD runs on Azure. It's a great platform, and it can be extended from a number of other technologies. But on Friday morning, they called and said the whole office was 300 people were going to be 100% remote starting on Monday. So needless to say, it was a very long weekend. My team did an amazing job of getting the Azure tenants set up, the applications that were needed for Monday online, but something was missing. End users had a lot of difficulty connecting on Monday. They didn't understand how to use the system. They didn't understand the difference between their desktop at the office and the virtual desktop that we provided. Shortcuts were missing. Map drives were difficult to navigate. Printing was non-existent. I can say it was a very bumpy road in the beginning. And that kind of leads me into The one thing I want you to remember from this presentation, I said that the people forget most of the presentation, and I've been on stage before, and I talk about the only thing you're going to remember is that I'm wearing a blue shirt, which I always wear a blue shirt when I'm doing my presentation. But this is important. If there's one thing you remember from this entire presentation, start to finish, or from the day, I want you to remember that end user experience will make or break your VDI deployment. And that's really, really important. So you start saying, a user is used to clicking on a link and having instant gratification. They put their PIN in, their login name, their password on their desktop. Everything comes to life. They have the picture of their kids as their background and all their favorite icons on their desk. If we're unable to provide what the user expects, then our deployments will have so many complaints that I've seen large corporations roll back those deployments and go back to traditional PCs. Now, COVID has allowed us to be lax in our end user experience, providing basic functionality so that people can just go to work. But we are already seeing that end users talking about the good old days when everything was available to them, when things just worked. And people who had VDI in the past were saying now that, well, when everybody got on, we just didn't have the capacity or something went wrong because everything was slow. And, that fear, uncertainty, doubt, it'll rule for a short period of time, but don't lose sight of that end game. That end user experience in the long haul is the most important thing. And again, work is something we do. It's not somewhere we go. And in the 90s, I ran a website called Telecommuting 360. It was a resource location for people that needed to see what the regulations were from working from home. Did OSHA play a role in it? Because, believe it or not, OSHA regulations were part of the home office. How do you set up your home office? How do you get your ergonomics in play? Back then, we still worked 9 to 5 days. You went to work, or if you worked from home, it was a very short-lived, piece of work. It was remote access, not working from home. Today, work is all the time. I'm online 100% of the time. If, I got a call 2 days ago, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm not meaning that as figuratively, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It was actually 3 o'clock in the morning. And someone was calling me to say that there had been a compromise in security at one of their accounts and needed us to get a team of people online immediately and get it working. So we're all online and we're active all the time. We answer the calls whenever it comes in. I need to have access to my resources from anywhere. And it seems that we may not work that typical 9 to 5. We're definitely working more than 8 hours a day these days. And I'd like to get back to the old days when we weren't doing that. And so, I want to admit that, I took a number of presentations that I've done in the past and to put them together for this slideshow. These 2 next slides are a presentation I did with iGel on the thin client side of the house. And iGel may do some things that are the same or similar and have, but different language tied to it. The point that I want to make with our end user computing slide is that there are a number of different private cloud offerings. You've got your main vendors, Citrix and VMware, Amazon, Microsoft. You have your Google Cloud. You have some private things like Parallels and the XI Frame, which is from Nutanix. And actually, let's go back to that. And the thing you need to recognize is that whether your cloud is on Microsoft or on one of the other vendors, private data center somewhere, your end users are still going to be accessing them from the same places, right? They're going to be at home, they're going to be at their office, or we talk about this anywhere, and Ron being at the Holiday Inn Express, and there was for a very long time, everyone was on VPNs, and hotels like Holiday Inn didn't allow VPN technology. So if you were working there, you're pretty much, out of luck. Now, the endpoint is still really, really complex. The biggest challenge that we had with our healthcare client cutover was the endpoint. We didn't realize how many different ways people were trying to connect, that their machines hadn't been patched in years. They were running Win 7, Win 10, a dozen different versions of Mac OS. They had Chromebooks, Android tablets, along with those iPads. And all of those devices were overrun with malware, or we want to call it bloatware, as they surfed the web and they downloaded things to their machines. They had no disk space. All these really challenges at the home. And IGEL talks about how if we have just the UD Pocket, we can convert all of those devices into a thin client that simply just works, and the endpoint would all be consistent. Those users that we were supporting, not only didn't they have those security updates and whatnot, they really had no bandwidth available. We were trying to figure out how these, end users worked at all, how they survived, doing the things that they did with the levels of bandwidth that they had. They were paying for broadband, but they were getting far less than they had, than they were paying for. They were getting primarily what we would consider dial-up. And of course, you guessed it, as we open up those floodgates to our new environment, our security perimeter extended to all of those home users, sharing the bandwidth with their kids, their televisions, at times their neighbors. And we suddenly realized that our pristine interior with all of our firewalls, all of our data inspection was useless when it came to the endpoints that we were allowing to access the environment, all in the name of expediency. And we went back and looked at the employee handbook and looked at the remote access policies and email policies, but nothing truly defined working from home. And how would we ensure that our corporate standards were being met, that we were keeping our employees safe when we couldn't even see them? And it was a real challenge. And looking at those gaps in our security posture was really an eye-opener. When people were on VPN, we had certain lockdowns and we had certain restrictions. But once they came in through our new environment with WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop, things were changed. And we had to go back to back to the drawing board a little bit. So we went back to that drawing board and we reviewed all the things we had normally to consider when we weren't running around with our hair on fire, trying to get people access to those systems. What systems will end users use as the question become, what will we as an organization allow our end users to use when connecting to our system? And the answer turned out to be devices we issue, and not the end user's machine. This solved the consistency issue and the compliance one. Would we provide them entire desktops or just apps? This argument goes all the way back to the early 1990s when Citrix argued that having two desktops was too confusing, and that people and publishing apps was the way to go. And this is how they were going to differentiate themselves from Microsoft's RDP client and others. When we looked at it, we decided to use those desktops. A desktop as a secondary screen, there's just too many integrations with the applications. And with us providing those physical desktops as well, we could control the end user's experience. And remember that number one rule I told you, end user experience will make or break that VDI deployment. So we'd allow users to have a full and unrestricted access to our environment, or when we use remote proxy solution, we went with the gateway. VPNs, so I'm going to talk about in a little bit, they weren't built for consistent users for everyone to use it. They were built for a few people to use it, the administrators to use it, few access, little access. When we opened the floodgates to 300 people, we just overrun those ASAs that we had at the time. They could have bought new ones. They could have gone larger. The decision was to go with the gateway. And then we went through and would we let someone else manage our desktop or would we manage it ourselves? We chose to manage it ourselves. And in the end, did the public cloud make sense or a private cloud work better? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, in the future. So another consideration, back to those pesky users. We say that without users, IT would be a lot easier. Of course, none of us would have any jobs, so we need those users. Help desk support was even more critical now than it ever was before. We couldn't just send a tech over to the client's house. We had to train our staff to understand the different complexities of the home user or the remote user. And our users needed more training, not to simply throw up their hands and call the help desk every time something didn't go as expected. Lots of issues with connectivity were just, reset the modem or let's take a look at what's going on your local machine. Are you streaming Spotify or something else, and maybe you just don't have enough bandwidth? And we needed to figure out a communication strategy. When bad things happen, how do we get the message out? There isn't a loudspeaker at our employees' homes. People can't do word of mouth and talk to each other. If they can't get to our systems, how do we let them know? And it's kind of like, if you're not here, raise your hand. How do we know when their hand is raised? We just don't know. And now a message from our sponsor, Citrix, as people remember in the old days. And while this shows a Citrix solution, I want you to think of this in the broadest, terms of virtual desktops. Slide's a great representation of the different deployment models available with Citrix. The first slide shows a traditional Citrix model, Zen Apps and Desktop. Many people are familiar with. It's been the same for about 15 years. Before they were on an OS2, or actually it's been the same for 25 years. Before that, they were on an OS2 product. Everything's on premise. And the second half of the screen on the right side shows a service where Citrix takes care of the core management pieces, and the customer or partner manages the workloads. By the way, this is the same if you're looking at the VMware offering or the Google offering, where we have the back end is managed by them, but you're managing the images and other pieces yourselves. And on the right-hand side, we have a fully managed solution where Citrix is managing the desktops, and they can manage everything for the customer except for the applications that are being deployed. Now, this particular model, that managed desktop, is really a great way to showcase that if you have different needs, people need graphics like from NVIDIA in order to do high resolution imaging, or they want a better user experience, but they don't need it for everyone. They only need it for a small group of people. Well, you can kind of give your multi-cloud hybrid offering where you can say some people have this, other people have that, and we can pay as we go along for what we use. Now, there's a lot of obstacles with, that workers and IT face in these really unprecedented times with people moving to work from home. Most households, or many households, I want to say most, only have enough bandwidth capacity for the activities they do, like streaming internet, browsing. But now with all the users in the household online all day, both the family members and the neighbors are competing for bandwidth. What's more, many of the applications used for both work and school are bandwidth hungry, putting further strain on that capacity. In traditional enterprise environments, you can control everything from the quality of your WAN links and positioning of your Wi-Fi, the segmentation of your network, even physical access that employees have. In home, the level of workspace environment clearly doesn't exist. What's also likely is that some employees may have never worked from home, and their view of the internet might be primarily about access to Fortnite and Netflix, not to a critical business application. Note, kids might think Fortnite are critical, and those things are critical applications, so don't want to take anything away from them. But now that your workforce is working from home, security has to be the top of mind to the enterprise. And I know that we have security vendors going to be talking in a bit about how you're going to secure that endpoint. You're responsible for the security of the endpoint, and now that you have a larger perimeter, how are you going to secure them now that we've added, again, those 300 users from home, or 3,000 users from home? And home networks are particularly susceptible to cyber attacks because they lack enterprise-grade security. You probably also have that untrained human element, not practicing cyber hygiene. How many people have actually pen tested your family or the home user? And if you have weak points in security, such as home Wi-Fi, a VPN will only serve to open that security hole to the rest of the network, because hackers just use that as a jump-off point, to get to your inside. VPNs were not designated to handle the entire workforce at one time. Increased load on the VPN causes congestion and lag for performance. And in order to scale up those VPNs, you've had to buy bigger VPN gateways. And if you remember, the whole reason that Citrix was invented was because people couldn't get fast enough access to, at that time, Novell applications. And people were logging in over these VPN connections. They were called RAS connections at the time, and dedicated connections. And that type of performance just wasn't acceptable to the end user and their end user experience. Plus, if you get a single internet link, that puts your users at risk for disruption. What's that user's time worth if their internet goes down? just as a matter of fact, I'm doing this presentation from my office because I find that when I'm at home, I am competing for bandwidth. And, I am, my kids, they're not playing games, but they're actually working from home. They're on their own conference calls. And, if my internet goes down, as it has a couple of times, because of congestion, and it's not a commercial grade at my house, that was an issue. So I came to the office to make sure that I had the best possible experience for this webinar. But at home, you've got users streaming, gaming, doing video. Voice over IP is pretty much everywhere. Not too many people have POTS lines, for their phones at their house. And that's where we start running into problems with latency and other negative effects on application experience. And if the users have issues, they're going to start calling the help desk and causing some issues. And so, just as a slide, here's some of those challenges where people are talking about, different studies that were done and what's happened. I'm just going to skip over so we keep into the time that we have. So, workforce productivity is, synonymous with application experience. Home workers are, sharing their bandwidth with other members of the household, and bandwidth coming in from the area, from the different carriers. As everybody uses it, less bandwidth for everybody else on that home grade network. And if you have some bandwidth being used for remote workers, online schools, leisure activities, that creates some activity, some issues. And so, what the Citrix SD-WAN does, and we can talk about other SD-WANs offline, but, is we provide connection intelligence, so that the best possible experience can be routed for a virtual desktop, voice, video, or CRM, or specific applications. We can mitigate those internet options because most of the Citrix SD-WANs have backup connections so that you can use a phone automatically or LTE connection. We can actually combine the bandwidth to make sure you have the best possible performance. And because internet connections are always changing, we can actually determine based on the type of application, give a specific application more bandwidth or less bandwidth as it's necessary. Obviously, printing can wait for the most part when my Teams is, lagging in my, call them talking heads, where you hear the words, but the mouse not moving. Now, Citrix SD-WAN can identify about 4,500 separate applications. So if you're using it, chances are they have it in their list. And it comes with a number of advanced QoS tools. And one of the things that that it comes with that's really important that we talk about is the security profile. And if you look at the security profile of an end user, hackers are lurking and exploiting newfound weaknesses in those home networks all the time. And business attack surface have exponentially increased overnight, as we said before. The security of the business applications is always mission critical. And with the sudden work from home and that attack surface increased, you have to rely on some legacy security pieces. It's much better to use a technology that is going to give you a consistent security posture across all devices, whether they are on site or at the user's home. I can take a policy and I can implement it and I can push that out to all end users almost instantaneously across the globe. And I've actually seen this work in geographically dispersed areas where pushing the button has pushed out the policy. We can force the end users to come through the local office or internet, or one of the key features if we're using Office 365 is those SD-WAN devices can actually determine where the best front door for Office 365 is and give the end users the best possible experience. And it's a multi-layered security, right? So we have this comprehensive layered security strategy protecting that extended attack surface. It's got an integrated application-aware stateful firewall. So you're taking your policies, you push it out, and it's implemented. And the visibility is at the corporate office so that you can see what the end users are doing, and you can segregate those users from their home networks. So their access to the corporate network is not tied to the same QoS that everything else is in their environment. Yeah, social distancing for your application traffic. So I want to make sure that I had enough time to go over some examples and to do some things around the best practices and tools in the time that I'm allowed. And so I've got 3 real-world examples just to go over quickly and talk through. So one was we have a large furniture retailer, national in scale, and they have been looking at deploying what they can. It's not remote access to them; it's distributed offices. Their corporate offices are is one large office, and then they had smaller retail offices around the globe. And what they decided to do was to let Citrix manage the core. They didn't see that there was any reason to have their own SQL servers, and they didn't think there was any reason to have their own web storefront or web interfaces. It's not core to their business. They just had their apps that they wanted to run. They ran Agile Thin clients in all of the locations. They ran Citrix on Azure. Their main lesson learned here was trust but verify. When they moved to Azure, Azure was not ready for 4,500 user deployment. Azure and Microsoft were thinking about smaller deployments, and they had to know who to call for support to get the Microsoft teams to scale up their environment on the back end. It's just that it wasn't ready at the time. The greatest thing was using the Agile Thin clients so that no one had to worry about what device the end user had, and support was able to push out updates and give people new links when we had to move on a dime. Our second organization, a healthcare organization, when COVID hit, their doctors needed to have access to their actual machines in the hospital. This is a different kind of scenario. Instead of having virtual desktops, they needed their actual desktop at the hospital. And so what we did was we loaded what Citrix calls a VDA on all their desktops, a virtual desktop agent, which allowed them to come in through that NetScale in a reverse proxy. Our main lesson learned there was that servers and firewalls in specific zones and firewalls and routing might have to be updated to get to those end user segments. Server segments where we traditionally work with VDI is not the same as the end user segments. And the third one was an interesting one. It ended up with Horizon View on premises. On premises is not exactly true because it's a remote data center in their private cloud. And the challenge was, how do they design an airplane when all the designers are all over the country? And I want to say that the main lesson learned there was don't underestimate the bandwidth required to do a specific task. Things will always take more than you expect. So, looking at our process, and I'm just going to go quickly through the, when we first engage with a customer, our focus is on the entire client experience. This is from a very old slide. This slide is like 15 years old. Some of these companies don't even exist anymore, but the logic behind it still makes sense today. And, as all of the infrastructures become more and more complex, new technologies emerge daily. We talked in the first about it's Azure, it's AWS, it's Google, it's all these cloud methodologies. We look at this and we call it a abstraction layer. The success of that overall solution is determined on how well the client's technology investment in those strategies work and what the business wants. On the left-hand side, it's what the business wants that makes sense. On the right-hand side, businesses just say they want simplicity in their solution. They want it designed properly for the first time. They want one that fits their needs today but allows scalability. They want to utilize those past investments and can help increase productivity of the IT staff and the results. It shouldn't matter whose brand it is, and it matters what your commitment to that technology platform is. If you choose Azure as your platform, you go all in on Azure as your platform, and the importance of that. So, as you start looking at, at what we do, and this process is the correct process for any deployment. We focus on that end user experience when looking at that client solution. And we use this proven methodology: discover, assess, design, deploy, and manage. You know, when you go through the step-by-step methodology, mitigates costs because everything is based on a foundation. You need to look at your goals. You need to actually assess the user environment and use real-world data. That's important. Don't just guess at it. When you design it based on that assessment, right? When you deploy it, you have 3 phases of deployment. Everybody skips one of these phases. You do a proof of concept. This is IT only. IT to say, does it work the way that I expect? Then you do a pilot. The pilot has end users involved so that you can get their feedback on it to understand how it works from their perspective. IT is always going to go click, click, click. End users are going to say, wait, I don't like this. And then do the full deployment based on the pilot. And then once you manage it, make sure that you're actually reviewing and managing on a regular basis. And this is my last slide. And, you know, when you look at your best practices, following these things are going to make you successful. It's not a technology roadmap. This is a business, roadmap. Plan your deployment. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And, that's simple enough said. Second, don't underspec the environment. Most people use the tools that identify the bare minimum needed to choose a set of measurements. And this is Lakeside and Liquidware and Login BSI and all of these tools that are on the market that can verify your desktop, what it looks like today, and what it'll take to move to the cloud. But when you get to the real world, things use more than they seem on paper. And when you're talking about end user experience, that's all going to matter. You need to test everything and get end users to test it, not just IT. As I said, IT will simply just pass on the errors or say, oh, that's not necessary. That little pop-up, I don't worry about it. Well, end users stop at that, and they don't move forward. Setting your expectations is on that end user experience, roadmap. Let your end users know that this is new. It's new for them, possibly new for you. You're trying to give them a better user experience than they had before, but it's not going to be without some bumps in the road. Management needs to know that you've done everything possible to ensure the success of the project, but you don't know what you don't know, which is another famous phrase of mine. Some end users will be very vocal about that. You need to beef up your help desk, get more staff, and get your staff trained. This is different than what you've been doing before. They don't know how to support this solution. Every one of the manufacturers that I had on that slide and everyone that you're ever going to work with, has a best practices analyzer. It's a programmatic way of looking at your environment to see whether you did the right thing along the way. Most people either don't know it exists or don't use them, but they're extremely helpful because when end users or management says, hey, this isn't working, you can go back to the best practices and say, we did everything possible. This is the best we can do at this time. Things are getting better all the time, but right now, this is what we have to work with. Once your solution is deployed, don't expect it to just run on its own. You need to watch it. You need to provide it with the care and feeding that it needs and deserves. If you're not watching it all the time, and remember, we started as a remote monitoring company, you're going to see that things build up over time, and then they fail in the most catastrophic way at the worst possible time. I usually call those Christmas Eve, Thanksgiving, Easter, New Year's, when nobody is around and there's no help desk or OEM support to help you. And then once again, the most important thing, end user experience is key. Engage the end user in the process if you want to, have a successful deployment in the long run. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time.